Okay, so you saw the adult skull, and I went through some of the stuff. I didn't go over every bone, I think. Yeah, I did. For the most part, I think I did. Maybe I missed a few front of the facial bones, but I don't think so. I pretty much went over most of them. Now let's go back over um, fetal bone development. So remember, this was from a previous lecture where we talked about bones and we looked at fetal bone development. I want you to go back and make sure that you understand the two different types of ossification, which is bone growth and bone development that happens during the fetal period, and it happens postnatally as well. So one is intramembranous ossification, and I want you to remember what these bones are made from. I know it says derived from. Don't worry so much about what embryonic tissue it is. You want to think about what fetal tissue it would be. That fetal tissue is either going to be like membrane, or it's going to be cartilage, or it's going to be bone, or stuff like that. So if you don't remember, intramembranous is made from embryonic membrane. This embryonic membrane actually has a specific name. It's called mesenchyme. So if you've ever heard of like mesenchymal stem cells or mesenchymal stem cell therapy, basically they take those types of stem cells, which are usually more predominant during fetal development or embryonic and fetal development, and they can become anything in the body, not just like new muscle or new nerves. They can become any cell in the body. And that's why in intramembranous ossification, the embryonic tissue can eventually become bone cells, and those bone cells will help form bones in that area. So we're going to remember that most of the skull here and clavicle are formed in this way. And they're formed from intramembranous ossification because you want some stretch. You don't want it to be so hard and like not flexible in that case. And then we're going to remember endochondral, and remember chondral meant cartilage. So in this case, we're going to have hyaline cartilage that we start out with. So we start with hyaline cartilage in this case. It's not nice and it's tough, but it's still a little bit flexible. It's more flexible than bone to create all the other bones. So part of the skull is actually made endochondraly, okay? Excuse me. So when I developed this PowerPoint, I was still thinking that I would make you guys know what is neural crest and what is mesoderm, and I was going to actually color these bones with what is neural crest and what is mesoderm. And I decided for the semester not to do that because I don't think it's that essential for you guys. What's more essential is for you to understand what parts of the fetal skull are developed endochondraly and what parts of the fetal skull are formed intramembranously. So instead of using red and blue, maybe I'll use different colors like purple for where cartilage is, and then I'll use usually use blue for connective tissue, but maybe I'll use something different. Okay. What you're going to see that is on the lateral side, we see the temporal bone here. And so the temporal bone is going to have a petrous portion, which is a hard portion, and a squamous portion, which is not going to be as hard. The hardened portion is going to be made from cartilage. So there's going to be a break to about right there, where this is the external acoustic meatus, and then these are all the hyoid bones. These are portions of the hyoid bone. All that's made by cartilage. And then here we're going to come back to the occipital bone, and the occipital bone is also going to be partially made by cartilage. The posterior inferior portion of it, really the inferior portion, is all going to be made by cartilage or from cartilage. So you see that the base of the skull, the inferior aspect of the skull, and parts of the sphenoid bone, a little part of the sphenoid bone, is also going to be made from cartilage. And I believe, if I recall correctly, the ethmoid bone is as well. But again, it's okay if you don't know every bone that's made endochondrally. So this is all going to be made endochondrally. So yeah, parts of the sphenoid bone are also made endochondrally, okay? That means that the base of the skull is nice and hard so that as we start to develop the dorsal hollow nerve tube and it becomes really big and heavy, it has something to sit on because the cartilage is going to help hold it up better than membrane would, essentially. And you want that because those bones are not going to develop for several more months. As the baby develops, you don't want to start developing bone immediately. You want to start developing bone towards the end, like maybe the middle end of the second trimester into the third trimester is when bone is probably being formed. The other bones, I'll just make it green. Sure, I like green and purple together, but it's a nice contrast. So the other bones are going to be formed from membrane. So what that means is they all started as just a big sheet of membrane, essentially, that's going to cover the dorsal hollow nerve tube as it's forming. Okay, so that's all endochondrally formed. I'm sorry, intramembranously formed. And we want that so that we have that nice stretch. So as the brain starts to grow bigger and bigger and bigger, you can stretch that membrane. And even if you hit the wall, which would be the wall of the membrane can maybe stretch just a little bit so the brain can continue to grow. Whereas cartilage is not going to be stretchy. It doesn't have the same stretch. So that means the brain has to grow kind of up. When it grows down, it hits a wall of cartilage and has nowhere to go. So that's going to allow for development of the brain, for the brain to get a lot bigger. And then usually what I teach in some of my other classes is I help them understand that, yes, okay, so when you develop the skull, like the parietal bone, you're going to start to develop bone from the center point outwards. So imagine that was membrane and we start to develop the center point outwards. And then we have the frontal bone and we develop from the center and we develop outwards. So what you see is as you do that, you develop from the center outwards. The area where membrane is still located, that ends up becoming the fontanelles. So there will still be membrane between these two bones. That fontanelle is still where the membrane is because it hasn't become bone yet. So as the fetal bones start to develop more and more and more, and you have less membrane right there, that ends up becoming a suture. So this is like the coronal suture, the sagittal suture. So you see there's where the sagittal suture would be. We see where the rhomboid suture would be, where the occipitomastoid suture is going to be right there. All of those areas remain a slightly bit more membrane than you would like during birth, and that's because the head still has to grow a little bit for the first 2 or 3 years during postnatal growth. And then once the head grows to the appropriate size and the brain is at the appropriate size, the skull does not grow anymore. So your brain doesn't grow anymore. What actually happens is in terms of brain development, you start to prune your neurons. So you have way more neurons than you use. And as you start to develop mentally, like your brain starts to develop more and more and more, and you start to learn things, you will add connections to neurons or you will remove connections from neurons. And that's how you prune your brain into you being who you are and how you think, essentially. Okay. So some of the facial bones are a little more complicated in their development, but I don't think it's important for you guys to necessarily know that. I just wanted you to be able to understand, like, why is the skull intramembranously formed? Why are fontanelles there? What's the purpose of fontanelles? And how those fontanelles end up becoming sutures, which will end up becoming immovable joints. And we want immovable joints so that we don't actually, like, I can't, push on my skull and poke into my brain. Ooh, that would be a really bad idea. So I hope this video helps you a little bit prepare for your your lab activity, I'm sorry, your lab practical and gives you some pictures to help you with labeling some things. Label yourself. Don't just watch a YouTube video and think that you're going to understand everything. You really need to do it on your own. Label stuff, print stuff out, write it down, or say it out when you're watching a video. Just watching the video is not enough for you to know it. Okay. And then don't forget about development of the skull, especially for your lecture exam.